Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third edition of this Intro to Esports series. I am Bennett, and I am hosting from Michigan Virtual. Marcus and Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and share a little bit about yourselves?
Please, Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm Vice President of Gaming and Women's Sports Strategy at Turner Sports.
I'm Marcus Howard, CEO of Meta Arena. We basically turn any brand into a gaming company so they can use video games to engage both customers and employees authentically. So thanks for joining us, Jennifer. We've been excited to speak with you. We've had a great session these last couple of weeks. We spoke with a former esports professional who became a serial entrepreneur. And then we spoke with the CEO of an esports organization up in New York. And now we're delighted to hear from you about your journey in esports, your journey as a professional, and then just talk about kind of what you're seeing in the space and how all of that ultimately becomes advice that you can share with the students to get them excited about working in gaming and esports. So if you'll please tell us a bit about your background. Bennett's going to jump in and ask questions as well, but we're excited to have this conversation with you.
Sure thing. I think my background's probably a little bit more non-traditional than some of the folks you might have talked to. So I grew up as a gamer, mostly console games, main ones, and this for this group is probably things that they may have heard about from their parents. But NBA Jam, Star Fox, I played a lot of Joust and those types of games. So grew up in the Midwest doing that. I was mainly an athlete in terms of swimming and some other sports. Did my undergraduate degree at Minnesota, actually in the School of Journalism and Mass Comm. And I thought I was going to be an advertising copywriter. So there weren't really jobs in gaming at the time, and there weren't jobs necessarily in sports that I thought were attainable. My first job actually was selling soda at the football games for the Wisconsin Badgers. So I went to school thinking I was going to be a copywriter. I moved to New York with the intention of doing that after college. And my first job was for a media company for doing marketing for the History Channel and A&E television networks. So my job was to work with the network, understand what the shows were about and how we wanted to target audiences through marketing campaigns, whether that be on television or radio or newspaper or activations and things of that sort. And what I really loved about it was understanding fandom, why people would be interested in watching a TV show. What are they so passionate about, and what are they so interested in? Eventually, I ended up in Atlanta doing that same type of work for the Turner networks at the time is what they were called. So TNT, TBS, as well as Turner Sports. So that was NCAA March Madness and NBA and all of those networks. And I started realizing a couple of things with my career. The first one was I was executing other people's ideas and plans. So I wanted to be in a role where I could help shape that and really understand the ins and outs and all elements of what was happening from a business perspective. So how do you take something that's an idea or a concept, whether that be a creative idea or a business idea, and how do you turn that into something that fans can see and experience? And the other really big thing I realized is I wanted to figure out how sort of intellectually my interest in fandom could become a job. So while I was working still in the media group, I went to grad school. So I was working full time and going to school on the weekends for just about 2 years. And at that same time, it just so happened that Turner announced that they were getting into esports. I immediately raised my hand, made a really big, I think, sort of leap at the time, and had an honest conversation with my boss and said, I'm really interested in this. I think I could be really useful to this group. I love games. I love understanding fandom, and I'm going to school to learn about how to build businesses. How can I help? So what ended up happening is that morphed into me leading global business operations for eLeague. So this was in 2016. It started out that I was still in my other job, and they hadn't hired up a team yet, and they said, "Oh, we're doing this event at CES. Can you help us put it together?" And I did it. I've learned all the different pieces of the production. I sat with everyone and I learned on the job. I spent just about 3 years overseeing global business operations, which was really my role was taking other people's visions and figuring out how to make it work. Hey, we want to do a major. Hey, we want to do this TV show. Hey, we want to do an activation at NBA All-Star. What does that look like? What are the resources involved? Who do we need to talk to put that together? I think what's really unique about my role versus I think a lot of others in the space is I'm part of a traditional media company. So a lot of what I do is figuring out whether it's with publisher partners or streamers or or sponsors or anyone in the space. My role, a lot of it is taking what we have between Warner Brothers Discovery, Turner Sports, and Bleacher Report, and the differentiation that we can bring from a resources, from a talent, from a relationship standpoint, and put those to use to make everyone win. So I did that through eLeague, which was specifically dedicated to esports around competition. And then in 2020, we added VR gaming into the mix. And so with that, if you look at sort of the ecosystem as a whole, we have VR gaming speaking to overall gaming culture, and eLeague sits within that really to speak to the esports and competitive landscape. I think one of the trends we're seeing, and this jumps a little bit ahead to the question, but I won't fully answer it, is I think right now what you're seeing is as gaming has really proliferated in culture, you're seeing an understanding of the difference between gaming and esports. So for us, from a fan perspective, we really felt it was important to make sure that the brands really stood apart, but worked collaboratively together. So my team now oversees both of those brands and really tries to make sure that when we are talking about something with the lens of eLeague, whether that's Apex Legends Global Series or NHL Gaming World Championships, that's about the competitive angle, whereas BR Gaming is much more in the lens of the broader gaming culture. So that's my path. Again, really, I came from much more traditional background and was really, I think, within the gaming landscape, afforded the ability to have a lot of mentors in the space who really allowed me to learn what historically had been happening in gaming and esports and really be able to tap into that. And that I think is something unique with our company is we've always paired people endemic to the space with folks that might know traditional sports or media or entertainment and try to really marry those together to get the best out of both worlds.
Thank you for that summary. There's so much there to dissect. I want to give you kudos for making the leap and for raising your hand and saying, I want to be the leader or take the initiative of helping build out this esports initiative, this effort, this journey on behalf of the company. That's, I think, important for kids to know that A, you had to raise your hand, right? You had to take that risk and be courageous, but B, you didn't start from traditional gaming. And if we have talked about the book that I helped publish, there are 100 different career opportunities in there around esports. You may have seen the image from Nico Bassoms, who's in France, and many of them are not like traditional gamers where you're playing with a controller or a keyboard, or you're an esports coach, and those are roles. But Jennifer, as you said, that's a drop in the bucket to all the opportunities. But as a former athlete, I think this is helpful for the students as well. Can you talk about the similarities that you have perceived or witnessed or experienced the similarities between traditional sports and esports? Because I think a lot of parents and even probably school administrators don't quite see those parallels.
Sure. I mean, I think there's three really in the form of competition, in terms of leadership, and in terms of skill. We always talk about the fact that if someone is an esports competitor, they're doing the same sort of grind that any sort of athlete is putting forth and really being the best at their craft. I think what was so great about how E-League started is we treated it in the same way as we were treating NBA and NCAA and we were using the same studios and the same directors and the same behind the scenes people. And we looked at promos and how we were photographing, the competitions and the players. We were taking the exact same lens that we were for traditional sports. We were just applying it differently. I think what ends up being important with esports, where there's often a disconnect, is because it's all happening with folks' hands, you're not understanding the skill that's involved. The people that are in these competitions are so much better than your average person on the couch. And it's not always obvious if you haven't been exposed to that. And a lot of what we try to do from a production standpoint is help translate that in various capacities, because it's not something that necessarily the naked eye would be able to see without understanding the games themselves and what goes into them and what skills go into them. So I think that's an important element. I think the elements, if you're thinking about from a growth perspective in terms of, teamwork and strategy and all of those elements, I think that's important to think about, as well as the fact that I think there's often a misconception that the people competing in esports aren't worried about health in some way, shape, or form. You have the stereotypes about just sitting in the basement with an energy drink, and that's not the case at all. But you have that in traditional sports as well, where some of the best athletes in the world aren't sort of as good to their bodies as they could be. But a lot of times these competitors really think about their mental health. They think about sleep. They think about nutrition. They think about exercise. They think about all of the things that athletes do from a well-rounded standpoint. It just manifests itself differently than people might have traditionally thought about it.
Awesome. I have another follow-up question to that. You talk about kind of the level of focus you need to play video games, and we talk about traditional sports. I think that we see somewhat similar kind of experience around both chess and poker. And we're now seeing a resurgence of chess, given, the Netflix phenomena. And poker had its heyday. I'm not saying it's down, right? But exploded probably about 10, 15 years ago. In your opinion, do you think that the adoption is similar, or maybe facing a similar level of resistance, or is it more because it's digital? Like, people can see that you're using your arms to play chess. You have to use your brain in order to strategize around playing poker with a table full of other people. Is it? Let me ask the question differently. Is it easier to perceive the value of chess and poker than esports, or do you think they're similar?
I think, there's a couple of things at play. I think chess and poker, generationally, they've been there longer. Mm-hmm. And now you're getting into video games. There are now generations who have played. And I think that also is part of the reason why gaming and esports are more integrated in culture, just because it's something that there are the students who will be watching this, they don't know a world without video games, and some of their parents don't either. So I think that plays into effect. I think poker is actually a really great example, because we used to talk about poker actually as a comp a lot of times for esports, because what turned poker into something that became compelling from a broadcast perspective is the ability to see the flop. So you could see the cards and you could understand the strategy. And so when you think about esports overall, and you think about understanding gameplay, the other thing I didn't mention that really is an important factor about esports is watchability. Any game can be something that's streamed, but anything from an esports perspective, there has to be an ability for people to be able to view it from a spectator mode. And I think what poker figured out now, but it was probably between 10 and 20 years ago, as you said, was they figured out the importance for the viewers to be able to understand the strategy by being able to see the blind in terms of the blind is what I meant in terms of the cards involved. And so the ability for viewers to be able to understand what these high-level players are doing and get that excitement, it becomes palpable to the tension and the stories that go along with it. And I think that's what esports and gaming is now discovering, is the ability to be able to do that. So I think it's an interesting analogy from just an evolution perspective. I will say, I think with esports, especially because of all the different genres, I think there's a lot of ways that you can lean into those similarities, especially if you're talking about a game like Hearthstone or something that actually is card and turn-based. Whereas I think it also comes into play with games that just might be more complex and figuring out how to break it down. So, I think one of the things that we look out for from a broadcast perspective, is it a game that someone can turn on or stream or watch a video or an event or on television, and they can pick up what's happening between what the casters are saying or host or just themselves. That becomes really important because there's a lot of very, very popular games that are just impossible for the average person just to sit and watch.
Yeah. And I want to remind the students as they're watching, if you have any questions, you send them into the chat on YouTube. We will get those, and Bennett will share them with us and we'll discuss them. Bennett, did you have any questions for Jennifer on anything she's discussed so far?
I'm curious about the last thing you just said, and I also do want to mention that you work for the same company that hosts my favorite pro wrestling show. So I'd like to thank you and the contributions to AEW Dynamite and all of the pay-per-views on Bleacher Report Live. So that way, maybe you're getting a plug too. I'm curious, as a person who perceives themselves as the outsider looking in going into esports, and you worked in a more traditional background, what was the learning curve like for you as you're taking on all of these potential esport games? How do you learn about them? How is that being presented to you? And then how do you decide to showcase that in some type of television promo setting? What are the differences between the games?
Sure. I think, so the learning curve for me, like I said, I understood how the behind the scenes elements worked from a publisher ecosystem and from a games fandom ecosystem. There were a number of individuals on our team. One of them was a former pro StarCraft player who was a producer and then was my who is my colleague related specifically to partnerships at that time. And I would sit next to him and ask 1,000 questions. And I think the biggest thing for me that I would impart on anyone is there are very few jobs and career paths where you go in knowing anything and everything about it. And one of the biggest things that I always look for in an interview, and I tell anyone from any sort of career advice perspective, is you have to go in with an element of curiosity. When I interview people and I'm looking for how they think. I'm not looking for them to give me the answers. And so I think for me, the biggest piece of it was I came in knowing that this was a space that I knew of from a retail perspective, a consumer perspective, but I didn't know all that much, really, just in terms of how the licensing worked, how how different fandoms worked, what DLC cycles looked like for various genres. You know, there was an immense amount of terminology in terms of thinking about, you know, even HUDs and how we're looking at different streaming setups and graphical elements. You know, there were a ton of things and parts to think about. And I think for me, the biggest piece was I had some amazing teachers. Christina Alejandre, who was a GM at the time, and Nick Ranish were two people that I sat with every day and asked a billion questions to. And I think that sort of outward resource standpoint, I think was really helpful to me going in. To answer your question about the promos and sort of the selections, what I said to Marcus about the viewability and the translation was important. Can we translate the stakes involved? Can we tell great storylines, what are happening? Can we showcase the skill of these players are always a big element coming in. I think from a genre perspective, we've played in a variety of areas. We try to be mindful and sensitive in terms of what's going on in the world and making sure that we're taking that into consideration in terms of some of the games that might be more mature content and figuring out what those look like. I think the other thing we think about is what is our place and what is our value with a partner. So if I'm working with an EA or a Nintendo, we know they have all the hardcore gamers in their world covered. They're talking to them every day on social. They all follow all their handles, etc. What can we do from a resource, from a storytelling, from a partnership perspective, from a distribution perspective, that we're showing something new to fans and we're giving them more of what they're interested in? And then the other piece that I spend a lot of time with is how can we take our existing partnerships with sports leagues, whether that be the NBA, the NHL, the NCAA, how can we take gaming and bring a new spin on things they're doing, bring an additional fan touch point, showcase their games and their competitions in ways that bring in new audiences. I think those are the biggest things. If we can't explain, to your promo question, if we can't explain a competition in a 15-second promo, that means it's probably not for us to be able to do.
That's interesting. And especially with all of the different types of brackets that all these different games have, that's a pretty interesting qualifying factor, because sometimes it feels like people are just making up how you can win in certain situations. Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. Is the sports leagues that you already have relationships with, is that kind of lend itself to the NHL, the FIFAs, the NBA 2K franchises being turned into tournaments?
Well, it's interesting. The majority of I shouldn't even say the majority of those are all operated by the publisher partners, really. And so within those, they've built their own structure. Some of them follow very closely to their league structure. So if you use 2K League, they've actually created their own mode of the game that's specific to 2K League. And they draft and they have a full regular season and playoffs and all of those elements. And each league has their own shade of that. So the NHL has Gaming World Championships, where they have fans compete for 32 spots to compete for each of their respective teams. And so within those, for us, it's really going in, figuring out, okay, is there just a social media element coverage? Are we helping co-stream? Are we doing shoulder programming? Are we creating television episodes? It all depends on sort of what they've created and how we can add to that. With FIFA, prior to COVID, we had done a number of their FIFA Global Series events. We did I believe 2 or 3 in Atlanta, 1 in France, and we had 1 that was canceled due to COVID, where we had 64 players flying in to compete globally in those types of events. But in that case, that was really a league structure that EA's FIFA team had developed, and us executing that and then creating content around it.
That's awesome. And I remember the first time being exposed to any esports capacity was a TV show based on the game Madden, where they would have NFL players go up against the proverbial pros from their towns and just have them get their butt whipped by these gamers who play Madden all the time. And it was really funny to see that difference in, okay, you're really good at the actual sport, but in this esports setting, even though you have all of this knowledge, you just don't know it the same way this guy who's been playing in your jersey sitting on the couch can just destroy you. And I only say that because before I pass it back to Marcus, my recommendation for this whole intro to esports course was to have the president of our company compete against the kids inside of the course. And I was like, how funny would it be to just have that content of the president of a well-established company just getting his butt whooped by middle schoolers playing games. So I'm just putting that out there, hoping that it still happens at some point. So shout out to Jamie Fitzpatrick.
Amazing. It's interesting that you mentioned that. So we've done a couple of things with Madden, but most notably in the past year, we did a television version of a show that EA had produced called Derwin James versus the World. So Derwin James is a pro football player who is ridiculously good at Madden. Okay. And it was him just taking on anyone and everyone. And I mean, spoiler alert, he just crushed every single person he competed against, which is thus the name of the show, Derwin James versus the World. And so we had that air on TBS. And so we did cut downs of a longer stream for those episodes. And then there's a show called Underrated, which is actually produced for us by a third party, or in collaboration with a third party. And in that show, athletes try to up their sports game ratings. So last year it included soccer players in FIFA, NHL, NBA, and NFL. And so, for instance, Jordan Love, who I'm a Packers fan, I grew up in Wisconsin, as I said. Jordan Love, the rookie QB, was doing real life throwing competitions and other things to try and up his Madden rating. And for Madden, they actually have a ratings adjuster, and so we had the ratings adjuster in real time sit there and say, okay, based on how you did in the skills challenge, I'm willing to up you X amount here and there. And really sort of bridge that together.
If you ever needed any proof that virtual stats are important, just the fact that these NFL players who dedicate their life to playing a game get upset about the fact that someone else who isn't as good at them at the game gives them a different skill rating than what they want, that they'll go out of their way to have a whole session, that blows my mind.
Right? Yeah, it's pretty funny.
That's awesome. I want to talk a little bit more about your professional career in the industry. In this course that we have partnered with Michigan Virtual to produce, we talk about 4 different categories of professional pillars, if you will. And I finally remembered the 4th after 3 weeks. So the one I always forget is strategist, but it's strategist, entrepreneur, content creator, and organizer. Got all 4. Can you talk about, and if you want to write those 4 down so you can answer this question, you are welcome to do that, because my short-term memory is garbage. I would love to hear from your perspective how what you do at Turner, part of the Turner family, I guess, which is now Turner and Warner Brothers family, how it fulfills if it does, fulfills each of those 4 pillars, or if not, 3 of the 4, or just kind of describe some tasks you do and how they associate with those. Again, that's strategist, organizer, content creator, entrepreneur.
Wow.
If you asked me, I would not be able to repeat those back to you right now. So well done.
Thank you.
So let me do this. Let me tell you about the day-to-day that I do and the different groups I work with. And I think I'll hit all 4.
That works. That's easier. Let's go for easier.
and see where I end up. So I think the easiest way of how I explain what my job looks like, I think you use terms like strategy and partnerships and all of that. And I know even in the working world, those are very sort of big picture and can be kind of fuzzy. So I know even especially for students, those are hard things to sometimes actually, like, what do I actually do during the day, right? Is probably the biggest question here.
Yes, for sure.
So the easiest way to think about what I do and sort of the role I play within our organization is that I am the subject matter expert for anything that relates to gaming and esports, whether that's something my team is doing for BR Gaming and E-League, or it might be some other group wanting to do something in the space and they want someone to weigh in terms of what that looks like. What my day-to-day job, though, actually is that I'm the conductor. So if you're thinking about an orchestra, I'm the one who's developing the sheet music. So I'm developing the plan for everyone to follow. I'm responsible for keeping the tempo, and my job is to make sure that everyone has what they need to shine. So I am not the one posting individual posts on our social media pages. I'm not the one who is editing our shows. What I am responsible for, though, is making sure all of the experts who do those things, they know what shows we're doing and when. They get budgets for each of them, which I provide them for each of the different groups, and that they are getting regular feedback in terms of what that looks like and how that's sort of prioritized in terms of the greater scheme of things. So what I do with we're now in July, over the next couple of months, my job is to sit down and look at what our schedule is going to be for the next year, and then continually make changes based on things that are happening, new games coming out, or people we want to work with, or things of that nature. So to answer your question, I have them written down in terms of strategist,
organizer. There you go.
Organizer, entrepreneur, and content creator. So there's 3 buckets to my world: strategic planning. So that's what I was saying in terms of that roadmap. And that might be specific to, okay, how many television hours do I have for the year? What does our schedule look like? How many shows do we want to do for NHL and Apex? And what does the paperwork look like for that? What are the resources involved in that? So that's where that organization piece comes in. So I might be working with our talent services team, who's responsible for booking all of the people on camera for that. I might be working with legal on the paperwork for it. I might be working with marketing and PR around the communication strategy and advertising we're doing for it. Finance on the budgets, scenic shop to build our set, the studio to make sure we have time, our programming team to make sure that we have social content happening. So content creators, one of the other pieces. We have that from a television perspective, making the shows that we do. So producers, directors, editors, stage managers. There's so many behind the scenes pieces to that. And then the last one, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, there's no official sort of league structure to any of this, right? So each of the different games has their own leagues and their own schedules. But for me as an organization, we're working with them to figure out, are we taking all of their events? Are we taking some of them? Are we only taking North America? And so from an entrepreneurial standpoint, what's really interesting is I work within a sports group, but my job is very much more entrepreneurial than the people working on the NBA team. There's a lot of creativity and a lot of unstructured elements to that. But there's a roadmap that's been built for 75 years of what the NBA schedule looks like. And there is a multi-year deal about what the regular season games are. There are tons of other factors that the NBA team deals with that I don't. But for us and for the space as a whole with gaming and esports, it's a completely open sort of system. The thing I would tell students too, which I think, especially as they're thinking about careers in gaming and esports, I think there's often an assumption that you can be a game developer and you can work for a publisher, and there might be a couple other jobs, but those are it. The thing I would say is if you look at my group and you look at a lot of other ones, there are a ton of roles that you don't have to just think about those careers. It might be in business, it might be in comms, it might be in marketing, it might be in production. It could be in app development. That's a whole piece I didn't even talk about with streaming and the technical operations behind that. We also have people when we do competitions that are thinking about rulebook and competitive integrity. That's a massive part of esports, is making sure that how the competitions are run from a tournament perspective, that they're done in a way that's fair and is really trying to create the most equitable playing field possible for the competitors. And that really comes into play especially if you're dealing with a remote event versus something that's on site. So I think I hit on the 4. If I was late on any of them, let me know. But I think, to summarize, for me, my job really has 3 parts. It's the strategic planning, it's the partnerships. So that's working with the game publishers. We need permission to do anything and everything related to any of the games. So that's what I mean from a partnership standpoint. And then operations, which is all of those pieces that I talked about behind the scenes to make things happen.
And then when you inevitably launch your NBA Jam Retro series, then you'll be in the content creation.
Exactly. So I'll try to limit my on-camera appearances to things like this. I'm typically not in front of the camera.
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you for your leadership in the space. You were talking about, equitable gameplay. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we inspire and educate the next generation of innovators about how esports can take a better journey to more authentic and sincere inclusion. I see often, and even today, where some esports orgs or groups are almost kind of leveraging inclusion as a cash grab, to put it very bluntly, when it's not necessarily aligned with what we've seen out of those organizations for years now. And I think it's important for the sustainability of the ecosystem that we have both representation, like we're seeing here, right? People of color and women, not just in speaking capacities, but professionals and even the competitive players. How do we cross that bridge or build that bridge so we can cross it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about esports that is different than when you're talking about physical skill competitions is there really is no differentiation. Right. And so I think that historically esports, for whatever reason, majority of the competition has featured people who identify as men. I do believe that there are strides that are being taken, but I think it's a matter of putting intention forth to it. So it's not good enough, I would say, from a corporate standpoint, for us to say, well, it's really important to have women in competitions, to have women in talent roles, to, behind the scenes. It's important for us to actually be seeking out those people through recruitment efforts, through training, through awareness. I think that's another piece of it. And I think what often happens in these types of spaces is that we need people who are interested to have awareness and visibility into what's going on. And they in turn need that visibility and that support to be able to do that. I think, when you talk about even visibility of, let's say, women playing games, on my channels, we've talked about the fact that, and they're not mine, but like the ones that BR Gaming operates, the volume of men that are featured are not representative of the space as a whole. And we need to do a better job of seeking out women who are grinding it out and are showing ridiculous gameplay and high level competitors, that they're getting that same shine. And I think historically, one of the challenges is that was sort of saved to show first woman to do this, or something that's more heartwarming and inspirational, versus just showing the skill that these women possess. And I think you're seeing more and more of it. But I think what it comes down to, if you're a woman who's interested in it, to continue to do that, continue to stream. And one of the things I try to do is make sure that people can, you and I found each other on LinkedIn, I think, but make sure that people can reach out to me and ask questions and have those connections. Because what ends up happening, I think it becomes cyclical, where the most popular people are the most popular because they've gotten the most visibility, and it just sort of keeps that those groups up at the top. And I think it takes intention and time on the corporate level to really sort of lift that up. And I think for the students and those who are interested in those spaces, I would just encourage you to keep at it. And I'm always looking for great talent regardless. And I think others are. And I think we are at a point where I think across the board, there's a realization that we need to do a better job of inclusion. It's not where it needs to be, candidly, but that doesn't mean that it won't be there soon. And I think, especially with the next generations coming in, I think there's a desire, there's a drive, and there's a want for that to happen. And gaming isn't a space just for guys. It's never been. It's always been much more dual fandom than I think anyone ever thought. And it really bums me out that sort of historically that was what the mindset was. When I think about my house, my sister and I played video games just as much, maybe more than my brother, but my brother is considered the more traditional gamer. And so I think there's been that storyline for a long time that hasn't necessarily been true. And I think it's really important for people in my position and others to knock down those stereotypes, to show girls and women who are getting into the space that they're never have been the only ones out there, and how we can sort of help knock that down from a stereotype perspective, I think is really important.
Thank you for that. And my sister grew up playing video games with my brother and me. She's 18 months younger than me. And she will tell you immediately that she's better at gaming than I am. And I won't play against her in Knockout City. Like, I want to be on her team because she is better at me than that, and several other games. So I agree with you that it's a false narrative, and it's important for us to create opportunities for that visibility, because representation is part of the solution, right? Kids who are watching this need to be able to see someone who looks like them, or where they're from, or see themselves in some kind of way represented, to help them understand that that's a potential future for them. You can only, really achieve what you can see. So it's about creating more visibility about the potential.
I completely agree. And I think between what all sorts of affinity groups are doing is important too. I think that's one thing for myself as a white woman. It's important to acknowledge that there are immense number of women of color who are out streaming, who have different esports teams and things of that nature. And you're right. It's about breaking down those stereotypes and creating some intention so that the right visibility is shown on these individuals and teams.
Excellent. From your perspective as a professional, what are you most excited about for the future of esports?
Whew, that's a big question. I think
let me say the next year, maybe not all the way into the future. Let's go 12 months. Let's shrink it down some.
I always get the question, what does the next 3 to 5 years look like? And I always want to say, how about the next 3 to 5 months?
Right. Let's shrink it down some. Let's make it a little more realistic.
I think there's a handful of things. I think I talked a little bit before about the differentiation and understanding of esports versus gaming. Mm-hmm. I think the way that creators are really, you talk about entrepreneurial spirit, what's going on in the creator space, I think is really compelling. I really look forward to and think there's going to be more and more opportunities in that area where it's more structured. So folks aren't streaming just wild amounts of time every single day, where it's something where there is a space and there is distribution for them to be able to do that, but they're able to live their lives, right? I think that's an important area. And I think the way that the creator space is evolving, you're going to see more and more of that. I think the thing that we've been seeing a lot of more and more, and this speaks to sort of the generational elements that I was talking about, is a continuation of sort of what I'll call mainstream culture collaborations. So any furniture, fashion, sort of general cultural touch point right now has a consideration of gaming around it. And I think that's going to continue. As well as really, I think, you mentioned NBA Jam, but there's a lot of nostalgia at play right now, which is really interesting to see. There was an announcement about Skate that came out. So you see these calls for more retro games coming out. So I think there's a nostalgia piece there. I talked about traditional sports really identifying connections to bring in younger tech savvy audiences. So that's going to be a big part of that, as well as I think really these multi-hyphenate companies like FaZe, who just announced that they went public, right? There's going to be more of that. I think gaming fully becomes immersed in a way, and us as gamers, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but really sort of becomes something that fully is immersed in this sort of broader cultural conversation, I think continues. That's one. I think the other one is how monetization extends. We've always had virtual currency, but what does the fantasy space look like? What is NFTs? What do those look like? I think there's a lot of sensitivity in that space, and there should be. There definitely should be anything that comes down to people spending real dollars in spaces and understanding where that goes to. I think that will continue. And then I think the last one is really, what do competitions look like now with COVID being endemic? So we know with gaming that there's always been an ability to have a remote watch, but what is sort of that hybrid model look like, where you have some people in person, some people watching from home? How do you create that sort of total fan experience? And I think that's actually where the metaverse as a whole really becomes interesting. And how can you create these shared spaces and experiences and that sense of community when not everyone is going to be together? I think those are probably the ones that I think about a lot. And for me, it's exciting to think about how we as an organization can tap into those different areas and and think about them from a business perspective and think about them as a next generation for fans and new people younger people coming in for careers. Like, what does that look like? What is their knowledge base, and how do we tap into that?
Excellent. I have several conversations I want to have with you offline, because those are all compelling and interesting to me, but I don't want to derail this. Bennett, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I was curious on what your favorite esport is now that you cover a bunch of them. What's your personal favorite and why?
Oh, geez. This is a tough question overall. For me personally, watching, I've said this before, it's StarCraft, and the reason why, and we as an organization have not broadcast StarCraft, but from a personal standpoint, as I said, the people who sort of mentored me through learning the space. And we also had some other partners as well that were into it. But Nick, who was my colleague, and he and I shared a tiny office for the first 3 years of E-League. He was a former StarCraft pro. Mm-hmm. And so I would go to events and I would sit with him, and not only would I understand what was happening, thanks to just sort of generally understanding the game, but he was explaining to me the strategy and all the different pieces that would go into it. And having that depth and understanding of knowledge sitting next to you made it so now for me, it's something that I love to watch. I think that's one that I would call out. And that one also won't get me in trouble with any of our partners if I claim any favorites.
I understand. There's a bigger part to this answer to the question. Well done.
Well done. Well played. Well played.
And my apologies, by the way.
No, it's fine.
Anything else, Bennett?
No, I think this was a really fun conversation, and it was great to hear it from your perspective. I think it's very interesting that StarCraft was your answer, because we were talking about how it's hard to highlight certain games, and your first example of a person that you worked with was inside of a game that I still to this day cannot understand for the life of me. Well, and then League of Legends is supposedly the biggest game of all time, and I still have tried to play with friends, and it still doesn't make sense to me. So it's pretty funny how it's important to tell the stories of these games, because there is a community there, but it should be exposed. Everyone sees the event and how big it is, but no one really gets what's going on in a mainstream or outsider perspective. So.
Yeah, and I think, StarCraft's a great example of something that is a very complex game with such nuanced strategy, mm-hmm. and is truly a global phenomenon. And I think that's a great example of, that might be something that one of the students watching will figure out a way how to make it easily translatable for, people who don't play it. I think that's the type of thing that also comes into play in terms of what is a very popular game versus what becomes something that breaks out from a spectator perspective becomes really important. StarCraft has a ton of millions of people who watch it that don't play it, and they've learned those. And I maybe all of those folks have someone like I did with Nick who could sit with them and give the 101 to be able to do that.
Jennifer, we're a little bit short here before we end this session, a little short on time. So thank you first and foremost for that time and all these amazing insights. Back to adding just some insights for the students before we close out here. Where would you recommend them go to try to start their career? Let's use Turner Broadcasting, kind of the E-League ecosystem. If I am a middle school or a high school student and I'm just completely inspired by this conversation, hopefully they are, because it's been amazing. Thank you. Where would they go next to say, I want to start on a path to become the next Jennifer?
Great question. I think for me, the first thing is learn about anything and everything. So, if if you're of the age to be able to do so, follow our social handles. If you're not, we're on TBS on a regular basis, so you can check that out. I think, or on YouTube, there's some videos for competitions. Like we did a Nintendo Switch challenge. That's something that's certainly family friendly and can be watched. So that's a caveat that I would say first and foremost is some of our content is for adult audiences. So want to make sure that that's called out. I would say just to any student is to take time to learn about a certain path that you might want to take, and who are the players in that space, meaning who are the companies that do that, and follow the same, I think, sort of interest points that you do. But I also would say one of the things that we find a lot of with areas that are really fan focused, you want to learn anything and everything, including the things that you might personally not be as interested in, but are important to the space. So the first thing I would say is if you want to learn about, let's say, live production, I would look up all the different live productions that are happening across different genres. Learn the different ins and outs of them. You can look at different videos, you can look at different publishers and check those out. I would check out the bigger conferences that are going on and see if you can find videos of panels or discussions, and think of it really as a version of a class you're taking. If you want to become an expert in something, you got to study it. And it doesn't have to be sort of boring, rote ways of studying, but a lot of my job is sitting down and learning. And you're going to be a lifelong learner in anything and everything that you do. And so to have that mentality of, if this is what I ultimately want to be, I want to be a producer, I want to be a business person, what do I need to know and learn? And what do I need to keep up on? What are the different newsletters that come out? What are the different sites that have news and stories that are important to the space, so you can educate yourself and others around it? Through that, you'll learn names of people who can reach out to me, and those, I think that's the other thing, is creating those connections. And I think what becomes important when you're looking for a job is being able to express the value you can bring an organization, not what the company can give you. The goal is always for it to be mutually beneficial, and it should be, and that's always my intention. But whenever I talk to someone and who would be interested in a role, and all they talk about is what will bring them, it's hard when you don't have that mutually sort of beneficial standpoint. And so I think that's really important. It's the lifelong learning and curiosity, as I said before, are always the biggest parts. And if you're curious about things, you'll want to learn more, and you'll start to learn names and companies and things of that nature.
Awesome. Excellent. And Bennett, I think, can appreciate this. You are now our third guest. And I think we may, over the 3 episodes, have had that consistent theme of education and doing homework, which is ironic because so many schools think that video games are counterintuitive to education. So thank you for helping drive that contrarian point home. Before we close out, where can the students and their parents and teachers find Turner E-League, follow you and support your journey, or contact you if there are other opportunities that make sense for you or for the business?
Sure. I'll start with me. I'm not on social. So for me, it's my email, which is first.last.name@warnermedia.com. Jennifer.Dill@warnermedia.com is the easiest way. For the parents and teachers, you can find me on LinkedIn. In terms of our E-League, BR Gaming, etc., as I said, we're on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. etc. We have YouTube and Twitch pages, as well as a Monday night at midnight spot on TBS. So those of you who can't stay up that late, you should be able to get it on demand as well, or DVR it to watch it at a more appropriate time.
That's how we know you're serious about connecting. If you're willing to give your email out, she means that she wants you to connect with her. So that's awesome. And
Yes.
of course, you can, if you have any students that are interested in the Intro to Esports course, the link to register is down below. Doing this whole YouTube thing that I've always wanted to be a content creator for, it's down here. And of course, we will see you next week with our next guest, Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. We appreciate it. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.